Mr. Speaker, I present the Representation Amendment, 6 regions per state, 2 senators per region bill and the explanatory memorandum.
Sorry, just wait till the clerk receives the bill. Yeah.
First reading, a bill for an Act to amend the Representation Act 1983 and for related purposes.
I call the member for New England.
Mr. Speaker, I move this bill now be read a second time. Mr. Speaker, it's an anomaly in our nation that 70% of our nation in the House of Representatives is represented by merely less than 4% of the members. It is also an anomaly in our nation that in the West Washington system, where the House of Representatives is based on the Westminster system and the Senate is based on the Washington system, that we have never actually developed new states. So we have vast swathes of our nation that don't have Senate representation. It is generally the case that 11 out of 12 senators come from the capital city. We've seen that in Western Australia, I believe, currently, South Australia, Victoria, and even in New South Wales, where 11 out of 12 come from Sydney or Wollongong. What this means is vast swathes of our nation do not have, in geographic area, do not have a Senate representation. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, but Indigenous Australians who are calling for a voice to Parliament are missing a voice in Parliament. If we had, what we need, Mr. Speaker, is 6 regions per state, which we can do by an act of this House, by an act of this Parliament, and no region of those 6 should be bigger than 30% of the state, and no urban basin should be more than 1 region. It would not be unusual when you consider that in the United States, New York has 2 senators, but in Australia, Adelaide has 11. We need to make sure that we give, as the seats get bigger and bigger and bigger in the House of Representatives and regional areas, that this is offset by the capacity to get more Senate representation. What we have in the Constitution, Mr. Speaker, this does not need a referendum, is the capacity within Chapter 1, Part 2, Clause 7, where it states that the Senate shall be composed of senators for each state directly chosen by the people of the state, voting until the Parliament otherwise decides as one electorate, until the Parliament otherwise decides. So an amendment of the Parliament can change how the Parliament decides. Mr. Speaker, this is something that is so important. If we had 2 senators per region, one would get in, I imagine, on around about 40% of the vote. One would get in on around about 30% of the vote, and the rest of the vote would exhaust. Which means that in areas such as the Gulf of Carpentaria, we have a great chance of Indigenous representation. And in the Kimberley, and in other areas of Western Australia, maybe Western New South Wales, we have the capacity to have Indigenous representation in one of the most powerful elected bodies of this nation, the Senate. Of course, it will also mean that we'd have offices in regional areas which people would have access to. And to be quite frank, senators would have something that they haven't had for quite some time, constituents, who walk in the door with requirements on NDIS, on issues pertinent to health and education, rather than residing, many instances, in one building in the centre of town, which you have to go through security to get access to. We need for our Senate to have a constituency and to have the capacity to represent a geographic area. Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't take much for a competent representative to get elected if they required about 30% of the vote. A competent independent could do it. Obviously, a competent member of the Labor Party, a competent member of the Liberal Party, a competent member of the National Party, of the Greens. It is not at the exclusion of any party. It's at the inclusion. But it gives the regions vastly more say in how they do this. Mr Speaker, I'm not going to suspend standing orders. People have asked me about that, but I reserve the right to do so in the future. This has been within the National Party policy. They've come to federal conferences and argued for this. And I can't see the point of people coming to federal conferences if you don't actually follow through what they want. It's just a talk fest. And we should be able to stand behind issues like this and see them through. Mr Speaker, in the last election, the Labor Party got one senator up in Queensland. Mr Deputy Speaker, they got one senator up in Queensland. So things are not working well for them. And the Labor Party itself should be looking strongly at this, to how they get their constituency that they wish to represent in areas such as central Queensland or north or the far north Queensland or the Gulf, how they get those views represented. And maybe in so doing, it have the capacity to turn policy in such a way as to temper some of the effects that happens when you get an over-urbanisation of the vote. Remember, the vast number of the votes in this place are from the capital cities. And it is perverse to think there's even a greater representation of senators from the capital cities. So that when an issue goes through, it has not only the benefit of the vast majority of the numbers in the House of Representatives, it's also got the support of the vast majority of people in the Senate. Now, the United States created pastoral states, and by so doing, they had 2 senators per state. And this gave greater representation. We seem to have completely at odds with creating new states. So the only way to do it, to get this representation of Indigenous people, of regional areas, and a better balance, is to have regional senators that were noted, as I noted before. Now, I see the member for Kennedy here, who's seconding this bill, and I'm going to allow the rest of my time for him to speak.
Order. Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion. And,
I call the member for Kennedy.
Mr. Speaker, if we had the power in North Queensland, a rail line would be built into the Galilee, would have been built some 7 or 8 years ago. That would have brought $25,000 million a year into the Australian economy. Hell's Gate would have been built some 10 or 15 years ago, $3 billion into the North Queensland economy. Bradfield was announced, actually, 30 years ago, by both state and federal government. There's $6 billion a year. And the Northern Canal, $7 billion. I mean, just $50 billion the Australian people could be having every year. But it's not that our voices are not heard, it's that we can't even communicate anyone our voices. Now, at the present moment, the Government of Queensland has proposed the shutdown of the coal industry and advocated it, and they've advocated the shutdown of the sugarcane industry. Well, Queensland only has 2 industries, and they're both centred in North Queensland. The entire economy of North Queensland would simply shut down. And there are some very big question marks hanging over Mount Isa, the only other major employer. Our tourism is down over 30%, probably down around 50% now, and that was before. This was before this trauma that came in. So, Mr. Acting Speaker, this is a way to give us a little bit more power, a little tiny bit more power. The great commentator on democracy, Alex de Tocqueville, he wrote his famous book, Tyranny of the Majority. Democracy does not deliver a fair go. It doesn't deliver justice. It doesn't even deliver representation, but it does deliver the tyranny of the majority. And Locke, in his book on freedom, uses tyranny of the majority phrase again and again and again. In Queensland, the main roads department was divided up into 5 divisions. Each division got an equal amount of money. So once upon a time, there were fair governments. Now, just to use the approach from the airport in Brisbane into the CBD, $5.5 billion in overpasses. Then we go into a $7 billion tunnel, and there's another $5.5 billion when you come out of the tunnel at Bowen Hills. So it's $18 billion just on one road leading into the CBD. And there are 4 roads leading into the CBD. Now, there's just nothing like that in North Queensland. Nothing remotely like that in North Queensland. So, fairness, the electricity, we have no baseload power in North Queensland. In fact, the nearest baseload station is 1,000 kilometres away. So the cost of taking electricity from down there to up here is colossal. It works out to about $600 million a year. Now, someone's got to come up with that $600 million a year, Mr. Speaker. As far as dams and weirs go, we've got about 85% of Australia's water in North Queensland. We have 6 dams and weirs. The southeastern corner state would have over 100 dams and weirs. And yet we got all the water, but we got no dams and irrigation to hold it back. Their rivers actually run all the time. Our rivers only run for
the
a
honourable
short period
member's
of the year.
time has expired. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. The time allocated for this debate has expired. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of day for the next sitting.